talk about the kingdoms and states of Africa. So in particular, we're going to look at Western Africa. So we're going to talk about three kingdoms that sits right here. So Ghana, and then Mali, and then Songhai, which you see right here on this map. We're going to talk about culture throughout Africa, and then we're going to end up with slavery and kind of how that actually impacts Africa. All right, here we go. So Ghana flourished from the 8th to the 13th century. In where Songhai is. It's not quite as big as what Songhai becomes, but they traded in salt and gold. So salt and gold was actually produced elsewhere, but they would bring it in and they would sell it there, and that was kind of the basis of their economy. The Berbers. So the Berbers were a nomadic people whose camel caravans were called the fleets of the desert. So we did talk about them in the last unit. So they're nomadic people, okay, and they go from oasis to oasis, but they started to become a lot of the transportation of the trade, moving goods across the desert. And there was a strong confederation wherein tribal rulers paid tribute to the king, and that's kind of how they operated in Ghana there. So after the decline of Ghana, Mali is going to take its place, and it's going to expand farther out from Ghana. They'll be ruled really similarly in that the tribal rulers will pay tribute to the king, but the only difference is that a standing army is going to be created by the king, basically to secure his power. Okay, so I'm going to show you here a map that shows you where I'm talking about. So you can see that these kingdoms overlap, but they don't, because they all exist at different times. So Ghana is where I'm talking about here. Okay, and then Mali. So you can see how much bigger it becomes. And then Songhai, we'll talk about here in a second, is this yellow. Okay, so this is Western Africa here. Okay, all right. So Mali went into decline in the 15th century and was replaced by Songhai. Now Songhai was a great commercial empire, and they established a central government with a strong standing army, once again, that secured their power. Their capital was Timbuktu. So on this map here, you can see this is where Timbuktu, it sits right on the Niger River, okay? And so it's a wealthy Islamic center of learning and faith. And this is where we see it was a city that really flourished. And it was a lot like ancient Rome, where it was just kind of a center of culture and trade and economy and government. It was just the center of everything. And so they're going to decline in the 16th century as trade problems are going to break out between Europe, the Moroccans, and then Songhai. And eventually Songhai is going to break apart into warring tribes. And then POWs, prisoners of war from the wars, will be sent to the Gold Coast for the slave trade. Okay, and that's just right down here. Okay. So African religions shared a belief in a single creator God. Okay, so they were mostly monotheistic. Except they had lesser gods. So they weren't really monotheistic, I guess. They were still polytheistic, but they had like one god that was like really like the big one. And so sometimes a group of lesser gods would join the creator god. So for example, the Ashanti group, Nyame was the chief god, and then his sons were the lesser gods. And then so the gods and their religious beliefs couldn't usually be trusted. It was kind of like with when we talked about the Egyptians and the Greeks, that it was the people's job to appease the gods and to do rituals and that to make them happy, and then they would give them like gifts like of rain or of great weather or whatever. But a special class of diviners usually perform the rituals. So a diviner would be similar to like a priest. And basically the diviners believed that they could tell the future. And then those rulers used those diviners in order to make decisions based on what they thought the future would be. So it's kind of like when the Greeks went to the Oracle of Delphi. Remember we talked about that. And it was a very similar kind of situation, okay? And then ancestors are also important. So it was believed that the ancestors could actually influence the lives of their descendants, which is something we see in a lot of the Asian religions, where the ancestors can be important. Like in Japan, for example, ancestors can help influence your life. Okay. The afterlife, the souls lived in the afterlife as long as the lineage group performed ceremonies in their names. So this would be a similar situation to what we see in Mexico with the Day of the Dead. Okay, so if any of you guys have seen the movie Coco, that might be something kind of that you might be able to relate to this. But due to trade, Islam influenced American or African spiritual life. And in the 15th century, much of the population in the grasslands south of the Sahara had joined those in northern Africa accepting Islam. So you can see on this map here, this is the extent of Islam, okay, and how far it reached. And then Christianity is going to come in and it's going to take over much of South Africa and then the coastal line here and then Ethiopia. So Christianity was more successful in Ethiopia, like I literally just said, but there was a conflict between the Christians and the Muslims, but also with Islam and the indigenous faiths. So Islam rejected spirit worship, and in Islam, the rules for men and women didn't necessarily fit with the informal custom of the African cultures. So there was much more equality in regards to gender relations in the African cultures than we see in like the Arab culture that we see in the Arabian Peninsula and then Northern Africa. Okay. So early African arts served religion mostly through rock paintings, but wood carvers throughout Africa also made amazing masks and statues. So this right here would be an example of one of those masks. And they often represented gods, spirits, or ancestral figures. The knot culture, which is in Nigeria, is the oldest known culture in Western Africa to actually make sculptures. And then African music and dance served a religious purpose as well because it was a way to communicate with the spirits. And so the strong rhythmic pattern of the African music and dance actually influenced modern Western music. So we see this in like jazz, blues, gospel, ragtime, rock and roll, things that we even rap nowadays. It's a little more modern, but all those musical styles are definitely influenced by the syncopated rhythm of the African music. Okay. So African towns began as fortified walled villages, and then they grew into larger communities. So what ended up happening is they would build a wall, and they would like a big wall, and they would put people in it. People would build houses and stuff in it, and then the village would grow. Well, the problem is the wall doesn't just move. So sometimes they would build another wall outside that, but oftentimes they wouldn't. And so you would have like a fortified area, and then outside that you would just kind of have like the outskirts of the village. But inside those walled villages, that was the center of the government and the economy. And so artisans who were skilled in metalworking or woodworking, pottery making, they would live in them, as did farmers, and then the farmers would often work the neighboring fields. The king's relationships with their subjects was actually a lot closer than most cultures. And a lot of it has to do with the size of the kingdoms, but also the fact that it wasn't just the king living in the walls. Okay, so in like Europe, for example, they would build a castle and they would have the wall around the castle, and then the king would live in there. Well, in this case, you have many more people inside those walls, and so it's easier to gain access to the king. So the king would often hold audiences to hear the people's complaints and kind of see what's going on with the people. And so once again, he was a lot closer than we see in other cultures. So extended families were combined into what are called lineage groups. So lineage groups are the basic building blocks of African society, and it's basically where all the members share a common ancestor. Okay, so for example, my grandpa would be a common ancestor I have with my dad and his brother and his sister, their sister, and then all my cousins, my brothers. Okay, so that would be our lineage group, is that we all share a common ancestor, and that would be our grandfather. So elders had the power in African society, and everybody was expected to care and support each other, especially once for the older folks who, once they get older, it was important to help them because they were the wise ones. Okay, they were the ones who were there to support everybody. Okay, so many African societies were actually matrilineal. So in like Europe, for example, it's all patrilineal. Okay, so matrilineal means that descent is actually traced through the mother, not patrilineal, where descent is traced through the father. So we are more patrilineal because when we have kids, usually the kids have the father's name. Okay, so usually you see like the wife, husband, wife, they have kids, they all have the same last name as the father. And so villages educated the youth. Boys were sent to what they called the House of Men. And so fathers then taught the boys then to hunt and fish, to grow plants, to clear the fields, to go out and basically be providers. And then girls were sent to the House of Women, and that's where the mothers taught the girls how to care for a house and tend to the fields. They also learned how to be a good wife, and that marriage and motherhood basically were their entrance into the community. Okay, so it wasn't seen as like something lesser than. It was seen as being a part of the community as a whole. Okay. Slavery. So slavery had been practiced in Africa since ancient times. People would be used for forced labor or sold, and many of these people were captives of war, or they were captives, or they were debtors, war prisoners, and then some were even criminals. Some could be trusted servants and respected for their talents and skills. So, especially like when we talk about Muslim society, I know we talked about slavery within Muslim society, where it was seen as being very noble to treat your slaves good and then to free them. But that's what the next line. I didn't even realize that. But anyway, so like I said, they had a little easier there in the Muslim societies than they do when they get shipped off other places. Obviously, eventually, we're not quite to it yet, but eventually they're going to start to go to the Americas, into Europe a little bit, but into the Americas for sure, and North and South America. All right, and that's all I got for you guys today. Don't forget to finish your processor and have a good day.